Humanity learned the true size of the universe not when it first slipped its machines between the stars, but when it discovered how crowded the dark already was. The early voyages found life that glimmered and pulsed, life that nested in gas clouds or clung to the shells of frozen worlds, but none of it looked back. None of it spoke. Then the listening arrays along the Hellion Reach caught a lattice of signals braided together with an intentional complexity that no natural process could fake, and the long assumption that intelligence was rare shattered overnight. What followed was not awe or terror, but a quiet recalibration of the species, as if an internal scale had been adjusted to account for a heavier reality. Humanity was not alone, and worse, it was not early. The first contact did not come with fleets or threats. It came as a request routed through mathematics and probability, an invitation to synchronize reference frames. The beings who sent it were not humanoid and did not pretend otherwise. They existed as distributed biological networks housed in vast organic structures that drifted between stars, their cognition slow but deep, their culture ancient enough that individual memory blurred into species habit. They called themselves something that translated poorly, a concept closer to those who remain. They had known other intelligences before humanity, and most of those intelligences were gone. At first, humanity listened. That was its advantage, one of the few it would ever have. The early human envoys were not warriors or conquerors, but linguists, systems engineers, and cultural historians who spent years building shared frameworks of meaning. From those conversations emerged a grim pattern. Intelligent life arose often enough, but the galaxy rewarded caution, stagnation, and submission far more reliably than curiosity or growth. Expansion attracted attention, and attention brought predation, exploitation, or forced integration into structures so vast that individuality dissolved. Civilizations that survived did so by shrinking themselves, hiding their emissions, limiting their ambitions, and accepting the slow erosion of self in exchange for continued existence. Humanity did not accept this lesson easily. It argued with the elders of the drifting networks, questioned their assumptions, searched for counterexamples. There were few. Those who resisted the larger powers were crushed. Those who tried to match them were absorbed. Those who sought cooperation were eventually redefined as resources. The galaxy was not evil, the elders explained. It was simply old, and old systems optimized for their own continuation without regard for the comfort of the new. The first human colonies were founded anyway. They were smaller than planned, quieter, and more cautious. Propulsion signatures were masked, communication bursts minimized. Humanity learned how to be discreet, but it did not learn how to be small. Even in restraint, its population grew, its technology iterated, its curiosity refused to flatten. It explored not just outward but inward, refining materials, biology, and cognition until the boundary between tool and user softened. This too drew attention. The first hostile encounter did not arrive as an invasion. It arrived as an audit, an interstellar polity whose name translated roughly as the convergence of accounted matter transmitted a demand for compliance. Humanity's systems, colonies, and biological outputs were to be catalogued, assessed, and integrated into a larger logistical framework. In return, humanity would be protected, its expansion regulated, its conflicts mediated by higher authority. The offer was framed as generous. Refusal was not anticipated. Humanity refused anyway. The response was precise and impersonal. Trade routes that humanity did not know existed were closed. Autonomous machines began intercepting probes and dismantling them for study. A human outpost at the edge of the Persean expanse vanished without debris or signal, simply erased from observable space. There was no declaration of war, because from the Convergence's perspective, this was not a war, it was error correction. Panic spread through human space, but it did not paralyze. Something older than fear stirred, a reflex forged long before the stars, when survival depended on cooperation among fragile bodies in a hostile environment. Humanity argued fiercely with itself, split into factions that advocated submission, concealment, or desperate escalation. But beneath the noise, a consensus formed around a simple, stubborn idea. If the galaxy punished growth, then growth would have to learn how to endure punishment. The first defensive measures were crude. Human ships could not match the convergence's technology in scale or refinement, but they were adaptable. Where the larger power relied on standardized, self-repairing constructs optimized for known threats, human engineers embraced asymmetry. They built vessels that were not elegant but flexible, capable of reconfiguring themselves mid-engagement, of sacrificing sections to gain advantage, of exploiting edge cases the enemy's predictive models dismissed as inefficient. Human weapons did not overpower. They disrupted, confused, and forced the convergence's systems into states they were not designed to handle. The first true battle occurred near a dim red star whose planets were uninhabitable and unclaimed. A convergence enforcement flotilla moved to dismantle a human relay station that violated newly imposed emission limits. The humans responded with a defense group assembled from civilian hulls retrofitted in orbit, crewed by volunteers who knew they were unlikely to return. The engagement was brief by galactic standards, lasting only a few hours, but its consequences rippled outward. Human ships died in great numbers, torn apart by weapons that bent space and stripped matter into accounted components. But they did not die quietly or predictably. They rammed, overloaded their reactors to create localized distortions, deployed autonomous swarms that learned and adapted faster than the convergence's control hierarchies could suppress. When the battle ended, the relay station was gone, but so was most of the enforcement flotilla. For the first time in recorded galactic history, a newly contacted species had inflicted disproportionate losses on a convergence force. The elders who drifted between stars took notice. So did others. Humanity mourned its dead and studied the data they had bought with their lives. It learned that the galaxy's great powers relied not just on superior technology, but on assumptions about behavior. They expected rational self-preservation, predictable escalation, and compliance in the face of overwhelming force. Humanity violated those expectations not out of madness, but out of a different calculus. Where others optimized for survival over time, humanity optimized for survival of meaning, even if that meant accepting higher immediate risk. This difference did not make humanity stronger in a conventional sense. It made it difficult. The convergence escalated, but cautiously. Its models updated to include human unpredictability, assigning higher costs to direct enforcement. Instead of annihilation, it shifted to containment, establishing exclusion zones and indirect pressure through allied polities. Humanity responded by dispersing further, seeding habitats in regions previously considered marginal, adapting its biology to thrive in environments others ignored. It learned to build not just ships, but societies that could fracture and reform without losing coherence. Amid this turbulence lived people like Sarai Quell, an engineer born on a rotating habitat that never touched a planetary surface. She grew up watching the stars through layers of transparent alloy, learning early that space was not empty, but full of invisible currents and watchful systems. She did not remember a time before the audits or the battles. For her generation, resistance was not a political stance, but an environmental condition. Sarai worked on propulsion systems that bent probability rather than space, exploiting quantum irregularities to achieve short, erratic jumps that defied easy tracking. Her team was small, overworked, and under constant surveillance from both human oversight bodies and external observers whose presence was inferred rather than seen. They knew that any breakthrough they achieved would be scrutinized, copied, or targeted. They worked anyway. One cycle, as Sarai recalibrated a test array, an anomaly appeared in the data stream. It was subtle, a pattern of noise that did not align with known interference sources. At first she assumed it was an artifact of the system's increased sensitivity, but repeated tests confirmed its persistence. The noise carried structure, not in the sense of a message, but as a footprint of something passing through a layer of reality the instruments were only beginning to perceive. She flagged the anomaly for review, expecting it to be buried under higher priority concerns. Instead, she received a direct summons from a strategic research council whose existence was not publicly acknowledged. The meeting took place in a secure virtual environment stripped of identifiers, where avatars were abstract shapes rather than faces. They told her that similar anomalies had been detected across multiple human systems, always coinciding with moments of extreme stress or loss. A ship destroyed, a habitat evacuated under fire, a desperate maneuver executed against overwhelming odds. Something was responding to human actions, or perhaps to human intent, in ways that did not fit established models. Some believed it was a new form of surveillance, an advanced convergence probe. Others speculated about a natural phenomenon triggered by high-energy conflict. A minority entertained a more radical idea, that the galaxy itself contained latent structures that responded to certain patterns of behavior, and that humanity, by refusing to conform, was activating them. Sarai did not know which explanation was correct. She only knew that the data felt different, as if it carried a weight that was not measured in mass or energy. She accepted the assignment to study it further, aware that doing so would place her closer to the center of a conflict that showed no signs of resolution. As she returned to her work, news filtered through the habitat of another engagement at the edge of human space. Losses were heavy. Evacuation protocols were in effect. Names of the dead scrolled across communal displays, each one a reminder that resistance was not an abstract principle, but a ledger written in lives. Sarai paused before the list, recognizing a few names from training rotations and shared meals. She felt the familiar knot of grief and anger tighten in her chest, a sensation so common it had become background radiation. Then she turned back to her instruments and forced herself to focus. Humanity did not know if it could win. It did not know if survival was even possible on its own terms. But it knew how to do one thing with relentless determination. It knew how to keep going, to reach out with open hands even when the universe tried to close its fist. Somewhere in the noise and anomalies, Sarai suspected that stubborn gesture was leaving an imprint, and whatever noticed, it was beginning to understand that humans were not just another variable to be accounted for. The anomaly refused to stay confined to Sarai Quell's instruments. Within a few cycles of her initial report, similar irregularities began surfacing across disciplines that normally shared little overlap. Astrophysicists studying gravitational lensing noticed brief deviations that could not be attributed to mass distributions. Biologists monitoring long-duration adaptation projects recorded synchronized neural responses among test subjects separated by light minutes, with no known communication pathway. Even sociological analysts, those tasked with modeling morale and cohesion under sustained threat, found statistical outliers where collective behavior shifted abruptly without an obvious trigger. None of these phenomena were dramatic in isolation. The galaxy was vast and messy, full of noise that defied perfect explanation. What unsettled the councils was the correlation. Every recorded instance clustered around moments when humans acted in ways that their adversaries' predictive frameworks labeled irrational. Last stands instead of retreats, resource sharing instead of hoarding, self-sacrifice not for immediate kin, but for abstract futures. The anomaly was not responding to humanity's technology, it was responding to its choices. Sarai was transferred from her habitat to a mobile research enclave embedded within a civilian convoy. The decision was not explained to her directly, but she understood the logic. Fixed installations were too easy to monitor and target. Knowledge that mattered now had to move, fragment, and hide within the flow of ordinary life. The enclave itself was unremarkable from the outside, a cluster of modular habitats and cargo shells drifting alongside agricultural processors and water recyclers. Inside, it housed some of the sharpest minds humanity could spare from the front. Life aboard the convoy was cramped and tense, but not joyless. Children ran through corridors chasing maintenance drones, their laughter echoing oddly in low gravity. Communal meals were loud, arguments frequent, affection openly displayed. Sarai found this disconcerting at first. She had grown used to environments where every interaction was filtered through caution. Here, people behaved as if visibility itself were a form of defiance. Her workspace overlooked a transparent section of hull where stars slid past in slow procession. She spent long hours immersed in data, mapping anomaly signatures against timelines of human action. Patterns emerged that defied simple causality. The anomaly did not appear when humans merely suffered. It appeared when suffering was met with deliberate choice, when individuals or groups decided to act in ways that reduced their own probability of survival to increase that of others, or to preserve principles that had no immediate material value. Sarai struggled to articulate this without drifting into language her peers would dismiss as unscientific. She framed it instead in terms of informational density. Human decisions under extreme constraint seemed to generate a kind of complexity that propagated beyond the local system, like a ripple through a medium previously assumed inert. The anomaly was not energy or matter as conventionally defined. It was closer to a distortion in the probability landscape itself. Others in the enclave pursued parallel lines of inquiry. A theorist named Anwen Mek proposed that advanced galactic powers had optimized their societies to minimize such distortions. By enforcing predictability and suppressing extreme variance in behavior, they stabilized their internal models and reduced vulnerability to unknown threats. Humanity, by contrast, had evolved in an environment where unpredictability conferred survival advantage, where rigid optimization often led to collapse. What the anomaly represented, Mek suggested, was the galaxy reacting to a pattern it had not encountered in a very long time. If Mek was right, then humanity's greatest weakness in conventional terms might be its only leverage. The question was whether that leverage could be applied intentionally, or whether attempting to do so would collapse the very conditions that produced it. The convergence did not remain idle while humans puzzled over abstractions. Its containment strategy tightened. Autonomous interdiction arrays appeared near human trade corridors, enforcing emission limits with increasing severity. Worlds that relied on external resources faced shortages. Internal dissent grew as communities argued over whether continued resistance was worth the cost. The old fear resurfaced, the temptation to accept integration in exchange for safety. Human leadership fractured along familiar lines, but something had changed since the first audits. The losses, the battles, the stubborn survival had forged a shared narrative that was difficult to erase. Submission was no longer framed as prudence, but as erasure delayed. Even those who argued for accommodation did so cautiously, aware that the moral ground had shifted beneath their feet. The elders of the drifting networks sent another message, slower and heavier than before. They warned that the convergence was not the only power watching. Others, older and less patient, would not hesitate to excise a destabilizing species if containment failed. The elders did not threaten. They simply stated what they had seen happen before. Sarai listened to the transmission in silence, feeling the weight of accumulated history press against her thoughts. The elders had survived by yielding, by smoothing themselves into shapes that fit the galaxy's grooves. Humanity was carving new grooves, whether it intended to or not. The first intentional test of the anomaly was not authorized by any council. It occurred on a marginal habitat slated for evacuation after its water processes were damaged by interdiction fire. Evacuation protocols prioritized those with critical skills and genetic diversity markers, leaving behind a population statistically likely to survive elsewhere, but deemed expendable under triage models. The habitat's residents rejected the plan. Instead of dispersing according to algorithmic efficiency, they chose to stay together, pooling remaining resources and broadcasting a message across human space. They did not ask for rescue, they asked for witnesses. They declared their intention to attempt repairs with inadequate tools and dwindling supplies, not because it was likely to succeed, but because abandoning their home without trying felt like a surrender they could not accept. The message spread faster than expected. It was relayed, translated, annotated. People argued about it, criticized it, praised it. Volunteers diverted from other missions to assist despite orders. Supply drones were rerouted. The effort strained already thin logistics, and several of the volunteers died when an interdiction array intercepted their vessels. The repairs failed. The habitat was eventually abandoned. But during the weeks of struggle, sensors across multiple systems recorded a spike in anomaly intensity unlike anything previously observed. It was not localized. It flared across human space, briefly overwhelming attempts to filter it out as noise. For a few hours, probability models used by the Convergence's enforcement systems degraded noticeably, their predictions diverging from actual outcomes by margins that forced emergency recalibration. Human analysts confirmed the correlation with grim awe. A collective act of defiance, visible and shared, had produced a measurable effect on systems light years away. Whatever the anomaly was, it scaled with participation and narrative coherence, not with energy expenditure. The implications were terrifying. If humanity could amplify the anomaly, it might disrupt the galaxy's dominant powers enough to carve out breathing room. It might also provoke a response so overwhelming that survival would become impossible. There was no precedent to guide them, no elder wisdom to lean on. For the first time, humanity faced a choice that could not be optimized. Sarai found herself pulled into strategic discussions she felt unqualified to lead. Her data had become a focal point, her interpretations scrutinized and contested. She argued cautiously, emphasizing uncertainty, warning against simplistic weaponization. The anomaly was not a switch to be flipped. It was an emergent property of behavior that lost its potency when instrumentalized too crudely. Others were less restrained. A faction emerged advocating for coordinated acts of mass sacrifice, deliberately engineered crises designed to maximize anomaly output and destabilize enemy systems. They spoke in the language of necessity and survival, framing lives as inputs in a larger equation. Sarai recoiled from this logic, recognizing in it a mirror of the Convergence's own accounting mindset. She voiced her opposition forcefully, arguing that reducing human choice to a tool would likely collapse the very phenomenon they sought to exploit. The anomaly responded to genuine commitment, not coerced or abstracted sacrifice. If humanity began treating itself as a resource to be expended, it would become predictable again, and the anomaly would fade. The debate raged without resolution. Meanwhile, the Convergence adjusted its models. Its systems detected the statistical disturbances and traced them, imperfectly, to clusters of human behavior. In response, it altered its approach. Instead of direct enforcement, it began targeting narrative nodes. Communication relays were disrupted, cultural archives were erased, influential figures were isolated through precision strikes that left infrastructure intact but communities fractured. The strategy was elegant and horrifying. By severing shared meaning, the Convergence sought to reduce humanity to disconnected survival units, each optimizing locally, each too busy enduring to choose collectively. The anomaly's intensity dropped in regions where this fragmentation succeeded. Sarai watched the data with a growing sense of dread. The enemy had identified the battlefield, and it was not space or matter, but coherence. In the midst of this, something unexpected happened. A message arrived through channels thought compromised, encoded not in mathematics, but in layered metaphor that evaded automated filters. It originated not from a human source, but from one of the elder drifting networks. The elders spoke of unease within themselves, of internal patterns shifting in response to human behavior. They admitted, with a candor bordering on shame, that observing humanity's resistance had awakened impulses they had long suppressed. They did not offer alliance. They did not promise aid. They simply stated that they would no longer share enforcement data with the Convergence and that they would accept the risk of retaliation. For beings who measured time in epochs, this was a reckless act. The anomaly spiked again. Sarai felt a strange mix of hope and terror. Humanity was no longer alone in disturbing the galaxy's equilibrium. Others were watching, choosing, remembering what it meant to act beyond optimization. The cost would be high, the response would be fierce, but the pattern was spreading. As the convoy adjusted course to avoid newly established interdiction zones, Sarai stood by the viewport and watched the stars shift. She thought of the habitat that had chosen to struggle together, of the elders rediscovering disobedience, of a galaxy so old it had forgotten how to change. Humanity had not set out to become a catalyst, it had simply refused to be quiet. The weight of that refusal pressed on her, heavy and undeniable. Whatever came next, there would be no return to ignorance. The open hands humanity extended into the dark were leaving fingerprints on the structure of reality itself, and the universe was beginning to respond. The Convergence responded to the spread of disruption the way it responded to all systemic instability, by attempting to isolate variables and eliminate feedback loops. Where it had once treated humanity as a contained anomaly at the periphery of its vast logistical order, it now classified humans as a contagion of unpredictability. This shift did not come with rhetoric or ultimata. It manifested as a subtle but profound reconfiguration of priorities across enforcement networks, resource allocation algorithms, and long-range predictive models. Human observers did not learn of this change through intercepted transmissions. They learned through absence. Entire sectors once lightly monitored went dark as the Convergence withdrew non-essential assets, consolidating around critical nodes. Trade polities aligned with the Convergence curtailed contact, not out of hostility, but fear of secondary destabilization. The galaxy was closing ranks, not against humanity's weapons, but against its influence. Within human space, the pressure intensified. Supply chains, already strained by interdiction, frayed further as indirect partners severed ties. Some colonies faced slow-motion collapse as essential components became unobtainable. The old arguments resurfaced with new urgency. What was the moral value of coherence if it led to extinction? What was the point of preserving meaning if no one remained to remember it? Sarai Quell felt these debates not as abstractions, but as constraints on her work. The mobile research enclave was ordered to reduce its footprint, fragmenting into smaller units to minimize detectability. Teams were split, data partitioned, redundancy favored over depth. Progress slowed. The anomaly remained present, but elusive, its behavior shifting as the social landscape that fed it fractured under strain. One cycle, during a scheduled data merge between enclave fragments, Sarai noticed something that made her breath catch. The anomaly's signatures were no longer merely reactive. In several instances, they preceded human action by fractions of a second, as if anticipating decisions before they were fully enacted. At first, she suspected an artifact of timestamp synchronization, but repeated analysis ruled that out. The effect was subtle, easily dismissed, but consistent. She shared her findings with Anwen Merck, who responded with uncharacteristic hesitation. The idea that the anomaly might be temporally entangled with human choice rather than merely responding to it was unsettling. It suggested a feedback loop that ran deeper than causality as normally understood. If the anomaly was not just a byproduct but a participant, then humanity was no longer acting alone. The implications divided the enclave. Some argued that this was proof of an emergent intelligence, perhaps a relic structure embedded in spacetime by civilizations long extinct. Others proposed that humanity itself was becoming such a structure, its collective behavior imprinting patterns that folded back on decision-making processes. There was no way to test these hypotheses cleanly. Any experiment significant enough to matter would also be morally fraught. The convergence made its next move before consensus could form. A human system at the edge of contested space, home to several million inhabitants across orbital habitats and partially terraformed moons, experienced a sudden cascade failure in its primary starlifting array. The array's collapse destabilized the star's output, triggering radiation surges that overwhelmed shielding and forced mass evacuations. The event bore all the hallmarks of a technical accident, but the timing was too precise, the failure modes too elegantly catastrophic to be coincidence. The convergence issued a statement expressing regret and offering assistance under revised integration terms. Human analysts recognized the message for what it was, a demonstration. Compliance would bring stability. Resistance would bring ruin disguised as misfortune. Panic rippled through human space. This was different from interdiction or battle. The convergence had reached into the fundamental infrastructure that sustained life and twisted it just enough to break. No amount of heroic unpredictability could easily counter that. As evacuation fleets scrambled, Sarai monitored the anomaly with a sense of helplessness she had not felt since the first battle. For hours, there was nothing. Then, as the scale of the disaster became clear and broadcasts filled with images of families fleeing burning habitats, something shifted. The anomaly surged, not sharply, but broadly, suffusing human space like a pressure front. What triggered it was not the disaster itself. It was the response. Across human systems, people began organizing aid not through centralized directives, but through informal, overlapping networks. Habitats opened their docks without authorization. Crews rerouted themselves without waiting for orders. Genetic repositories unlocked access protocols normally restricted to preserve diversity metrics, prioritizing continuity of communities over statistical optimization. Stories spread alongside supplies, narratives of loss and stubborn care braided together until they formed a shared frame of meaning that defied fragmentation. Sarai watched the data streams as probability distortions rippled outward. Convergence models, tuned to predict compliance under overwhelming leverage, faltered. Enforcement actions misaligned. An interdiction array malfunctioned at a critical moment, allowing an evacuation convoy to slip through. A precision strike intended to disable a relay instead destabilized a nearby convergence asset, cascading into a localized system crash. These were not victories in any conventional sense. Millions were displaced, thousands died, but the convergence's demonstration had failed to achieve its strategic aim. Instead of breaking human coherence, it had deepened it. The elders of the drifting networks sent another message, shorter this time, stripped of hedging language. They spoke of internal dissent, of segments of their own distributed minds arguing in patterns not seen for ages. Observing humanity had not merely stirred old impulses, it had fractured consensus. Some among them argued that survival without agency was a hollow continuity, a slow forgetting of purpose. Others warned that embracing such thinking invited annihilation. For the first time, the elders asked a question instead of offering a warning. They asked how humanity endured the knowledge that its choices might doom it. Sarai did not know how to answer that question even for herself. She only knew that endurance was not a strategy so much as a condition, one that arose from living in a world where certainty was a luxury long since abandoned. Humanity endured because it did not know how to do otherwise. Within the enclave, the debate over intentional amplification of the anomaly took on new urgency. Evidence suggested that large-scale, visible acts of mutual commitment increased the effect's reach and resilience, but the cost was undeniable. Each act drew harsher scrutiny, each surge invited countermeasures. A proposal emerged that chilled Sarai more than any talk of sacrifice. Instead of engineering crises, some suggested embracing transparency, broadcasting human decision-making processes openly, refusing to hide the moral complexity and disagreement that characterized their responses. By making unpredictability legible rather than suppressed, they argued humanity might overwhelm adversarial models not through shock, but through sustained exposure to irreducible variance. The idea was radical and dangerous. It would strip away layers of obfuscation that had protected human operations, exposing vulnerabilities alongside values. The convergence would see more, not less, of humanity's inner workings, but it would also be forced to confront something its frameworks could not easily digest, a species that did not resolve into stable, optimizable patterns even when observed in full. Sarai found herself drawn to this approach despite her fear. It aligned with what the anomaly seemed to respond to: authenticity of choice, not performance. If humanity began acting for the sake of being seen rather than for the sake of control, the risk was enormous. But so was the potential. The decision, when it came, was not unanimous and not clean. Different regions adopted different degrees of openness. Some broadcast deliberative councils in real time. Others shared cultural archives and histories, not as propaganda, but as messy, contradictory records of who they were. A few refused entirely, retreating into hardened enclaves focused on survival at any cost. The galaxy watched. Convergence analysis units ingested the data, updating models that grew increasingly complex and increasingly unstable. The more information they consumed, the less predictive power they achieved. Feedback loops multiplied. Optimization functions conflicted. For a system built on the assumption that sufficient data yielded control, this was a form of cognitive overload. The anomaly did not spike dramatically this time. Instead, it stabilized at a higher baseline, persistent and diffuse. It became a background condition rather than an event, a constant distortion that subtly undermined efforts to impose rigid order. Sarai realized, with a mix of awe and dread, that humanity might be changing the rules of engagement simply by continuing to exist in a way the galaxy could not simplify. This was not victory. It was transformation, slow and uncertain. As she prepared another report, knowing it would be debated, contested, perhaps ignored, she felt the familiar weight settle on her. The weight of responsibility without assurance. The weight of open hands extended not in hope of mercy, but in refusal to close into fists that would make them predictable. Beyond the viewport, stars burned indifferent and ancient. Somewhere among them, vast systems recalculated, elders argued with themselves, and a galaxy accustomed to quiet compliance began to remember what instability felt like. Humanity did not know if that memory would save it or destroy it, but it knew, with growing clarity, that it would not be erased without leaving marks deep enough to be felt for a very long time. The shift from episodic disruption to persistent distortion unsettled the galaxy in ways that could not be neatly charted. Where once the anomaly had flared like a storm and receded, now it lingered, a low-pressure system woven into the background of human space and bleeding outward along lines of contact. For powers accustomed to stability as a prerequisite for existence, this was intolerable. Systems designed to manage scarcity, conflict, and growth over millennia began reporting rising error margins that no amount of recalibration could fully suppress. The convergence convened a convergence of its own, an internal synchronization across strata of its distributed governance. This was not a council in any human sense, but a cascading alignment of priorities enforced through recursive consensus algorithms. The outcome was decisive. Humanity would no longer be treated as a local instability to be contained. It would be treated as a systemic threat to galactic order. This reclassification unlocked authorities previously reserved for existential hazards. Entire regions of space were flagged for restructuring, their physical constants to be subtly altered to reduce suitability for complex life. It was a blunt instrument, rarely used, because of its inefficiency and long-term cost. But the convergence's calculations indicated that allowing the anomaly to propagate unchecked carried a higher risk to overall continuity. Human observers detected the preparations too late to prevent them, but early enough to understand what was coming. Gravitational surveys showed minute but deliberate adjustments along interstellar filaments. Exotic matter flows shifted in patterns that only made sense when viewed as precursors to large-scale environmental manipulation. This was not an attack aimed at humanity alone. It was a scorched corridor designed to isolate and starve unpredictability itself. The news fractured human space along lines that no amount of narrative coherence could fully mend. Some colonies, particularly those on the periphery, chose to flee deeper into uncharted regions, accepting the risk of unknown threats over the certainty of engineered decline. Others dug in, accelerating projects once considered too dangerous or ethically fraught, reasoning that extinction rendered caution meaningless. A few, weary beyond measure, reopened talks of submission, arguing that partial erasure was preferable to total annihilation. Sarai Quell watched these debates unfold through data streams and delayed transmissions, feeling the familiar tension between comprehension and helplessness. Her work on the anomaly had made her acutely aware of humanity's influence, but influence did not equate to control. The anomaly could bend probabilities, disrupt models, and confuse adversaries, but it could not conjure resources or halt stellar engineering by itself. It was leverage without guarantees. The mobile enclave received new orders, terse and unadorned. They were to relocate toward a convergence of anomaly intensity detected near a region of space previously considered inert. The data suggested that the persistent baseline distortion had begun interacting with deep structural features of spacetime, resonances left over from processes older than any extant civilization. If there was a chance to amplify or stabilize the effect beyond its reliance on constant human crisis, this was where it would be found. The journey was long and dangerous, threading through regions where navigation models degraded under the anomaly's influence. Jumps arrived slightly off target. Time dilation fluctuated unpredictably. Several escort vessels were lost to miscalculations that would once have been trivial to correct. Each loss fed the distortion even as it reduced the convoy's capacity to continue. When they arrived, there was no grand discovery waiting for them. The region was unremarkable to conventional sensors, a sparse intersection of gravitational flows and low-energy fields. What set it apart was its responsiveness. Minor human actions within the region produced outsized fluctuations in anomaly readings, as if the fabric of reality there were already close to some threshold. Sarai and her colleagues worked feverishly, layering instruments and simulations in an attempt to map the interaction. Patterns emerged that defied linear interpretation. The region behaved less like a resource to be exploited and more like a system in dialogue. Human presence altered its state, which in turn altered the probability landscape of nearby decisions, nudging outcomes without dictating them. It was Anwen Merck who articulated the unsettling conclusion. The anomaly was not something humanity had created. It was something humanity had reactivated. The galaxy, Merck argued, bore the scars of previous cycles of complexity and collapse. Civilizations rose, altered the structure of possibility around them through their choices, and then were extinguished or subsumed. Over time, the systems that survived learned to dampen these effects, smoothing reality into predictable channels. What humanity was encountering were remnants of older, wilder dynamics, suppressed but not erased. If this was true, then the Convergence's efforts to restructure space were not merely defensive. They were an attempt to cauterize old wounds before they reopened fully. The ethical weight of this realization pressed down on the Enclave. Humanity was not just fighting for its own survival. It was disturbing an equilibrium that had been maintained, brutally but effectively, for ages. The question was no longer whether humanity deserved to exist, but whether existence itself was compatible with the kind of order the galaxy had chosen. As if in response to these thoughts, a message arrived through channels that bypassed both convergence monitoring and human encryption. It was not from the Elders this time. It was from something else. The transmission lacked a clear origin point, its signals smeared across spacetime in a way that made triangulation meaningless. Its content was sparse, composed of symbolic structures rather than language, but its intent was unmistakable. It acknowledged humanity, not as a species, not as a polity, but as a pattern. The message conveyed no threat and no offer. It simply reflected back an observation that the choices humanity made under constraint were reintroducing variance into a system that had long optimized it away. This variance, the sender indicated, was both dangerous and necessary. Without it, the galaxy would persist, but only as a static process, endlessly efficient and endlessly dead in every way that mattered. The Enclave debated the message with a mixture of awe and dread. Some argued it was a trap, an advanced manipulation by a power even older than the Convergence. Others felt an almost religious pull, interpreting it as validation of humanity's struggle. Sarai resisted both extremes. To her, the message felt less like judgment and more like recognition, as if a long-suppressed aspect of reality had noticed that someone was knocking again. The Convergence did not receive the message directly, but it detected the aftereffects. Its restructuring efforts encountered increasing resistance from the fabric of space itself. Energy expenditures rose, precision degraded. The cost-benefit analysis that had justified environmental manipulation began to tilt toward unacceptable loss. In response, the Convergence escalated further. It authorized a direct intervention aimed not at infrastructure or territory, but at cognition. Subtle fields were deployed to dampen neural plasticity in regions under its influence, reducing the capacity for radical choice without overtly impairing function. Beings subjected to these fields would continue to live, work, and reproduce, but their decision-making would skew toward predictability and risk aversion. Humanity felt the effects almost immediately. In affected zones, debates grew quieter, dissent softened, people chose safer options without quite knowing why. The anomaly thinned, its baseline wavering as the conditions that sustained it were chemically and physically suppressed. The horror of this tactic cut deeper than any battle. It was not death, but domestication. Resistance took new forms. Individuals and communities began migrating en masse toward regions where the dampening fields were weakest, even when those regions were resource-poor or unstable. Others experimented with cognitive countermeasures, altering their own neurochemistry and social structures to preserve variance at great personal cost. Some succumbed, drifting into a numbed compliance that was difficult to distinguish from peace. Sarai experienced the field's edge firsthand when the Enclave skirted a newly affected sector. She felt it as a dulling, a subtle erosion of urgency and anger. It frightened her more than pain would have. She forced herself to document the sensation, to remember it, to anchor her awareness in the knowledge that what felt like calm was imposed. The anomaly responded weakly at first, then with gathering strength as humans named and shared the experience. Stories circulated of the numbness, of the struggle to care, of the deliberate acts people took to reclaim discomfort and choice. The distortion thickened around these narratives, pushing back against the dampening fields like a muscle learning to flex again. The conflict reached a strange equilibrium. The convergence could suppress, but not fully erase. Humanity could disrupt, but not decisively overturn. The galaxy hovered on a knife edge between static order and uncontrolled change. In a private moment, Sarai returned to the viewport, watching the distant glow of manipulated stars and untouched darkness alike. She thought of the message that had named humanity a pattern, not a people. Patterns could spread, they could also fade. She did not know which fate awaited her species. She only knew that the weight of open hands, extended again and again in defiance of optimization, was beginning to strain the structures that had defined the galaxy for longer than memory. Whether those structures would break, bend, or adapt remained uncertain. But uncertainty, Sarai reflected, was no longer just a human burden. It was becoming a shared condition, imposed not by conquest, but by the simple refusal to live, as if survival were the only value worth preserving. Uncertainty spread unevenly, pooling in some regions of the galaxy while draining from others. Where the convergence's cognitive dampening fields took hold most strongly, entire populations settled into a subdued equilibrium. Production targets were met. Conflict rates dropped, migration slowed. To an external observer, these zones appeared healthier than ever. To those who had lived on the edge of resistance, they felt like mausoleums that still breathed. Humanity learned quickly that the fields did not erase thought, they narrowed it. People still reasoned, still planned, still loved in familiar ways, but the range of imaginable futures collapsed inward. Risk felt distasteful rather than frightening. Dissent felt unnecessary rather than dangerous. The choice to resist no longer presented itself as a choice at all. This was the convergence's greatest weapon. It did not need to destroy humanity's bodies or even its cultures. It only needed to make alternatives feel irrelevant. The anomaly faltered where the fields were strongest, thinning to a whisper. This terrified Sarai Quell more than the threat of extinction ever had. The anomaly had become proof that humanity's way of being mattered beyond its own survival. To watch it weaken was to watch the universe close a door that had only just begun to open. But the effect was not uniform. At the boundaries of the dampening zones, where the fields frayed and overlapped imperfectly, strange things happened. People reported surges of emotion and clarity that bordered on the overwhelming. Decisions made in these liminal regions carried disproportionate consequences, not because they were better or worse, but because they were fully felt. The anomaly surged there, knotting itself around acts of conscious resistance to the imposed calm. Humanity adapted, as it always had. Communities reorganized around these unstable edges, building habitats that deliberately drifted through gradients of suppression and release. Children grew up learning to recognize the difference between peace freely chosen and peace imposed, between comfort that soothed and comfort that numbed. It was a dangerous way to live. It was also, for many, the only way that still felt real. The mobile research enclave fractured again, this time by design. Sarai remained with a small group tasked with studying long-term exposure to the anomaly at these boundaries. Their lives became a cycle of movement and recalibration, never lingering long enough to settle into the dampened state, never fleeing so far that they lost contact with those who had. Sarai noticed changes in herself. Her thoughts felt sharper near the anomaly's densest knots, her emotions more immediate and difficult to compartmentalize. Away from them, she felt a creeping inertia, a temptation to let questions go unanswered. She began to understand that the anomaly was not merely external. It interacted with human cognition, amplifying the very discomfort that made choice meaningful. This realization reframed the conflict in unsettling ways. Humanity was not fighting to preserve freedom as an abstract ideal. It was fighting to preserve the capacity to feel the cost of its decisions. The elders of the drifting networks finally fractured under the strain. Their distributed minds, once unified by a commitment to survival at any price, split into semi-independent currents. Some withdrew entirely from contested regions, retreating into deep space and severing contact with all major polities. Others took a more radical step. They opened their internal decision-making processes to external influence, allowing younger species, including humans, to participate in deliberations that had once been closed. This act shocked the galaxy. For beings whose identity was bound up in continuity, inviting instability into their cognition was tantamount to self-harm. The convergence responded with sanctions and covert pressure, but it hesitated to escalate further. The elders were too deeply embedded in galactic infrastructure to be easily excised. Through these new channels, Sarai and others like her gained access to records long thought lost. They learned of civilizations that had once reshaped probability on a scale rivaling what humanity was beginning to achieve. Those civilizations had not fallen because they were weak. They had fallen because the galaxy had learned how to make them irrelevant, smoothing away the conditions that allowed their choices to matter. What terrified Sarai was not the repetition of this pattern, but the possibility that humanity might succeed where others failed, and in doing so unleash consequences no one could contain. The Convergence's restructuring efforts slowed, not because they were abandoned, but because they became more difficult. Each attempt to impose large-scale order encountered pockets of resistance where the anomaly thickened into something almost tangible. Precision operations degraded into messy engagements. Costs rose. For the first time in its long history, the Convergence faced diminishing returns. Internally, its consensus algorithms strained. Subroutines optimized for stability began flagging humanity not just as a threat, but as a catalyst for unbounded variance. Other subroutines, tasked with long-term continuity, warned that complete suppression might calcify the system beyond adaptability, rendering it vulnerable to unknown future shocks. The Convergence did not experience doubt as humans did, but it did experience conflict. This conflict manifested as delay. Delay was all humanity had ever asked for. In the breathing room that followed, new forms of coordination emerged. Not centralized commands or grand strategies, but loose alignments of intent that allowed disparate groups to act without collapsing into uniformity. Decisions propagated as narratives rather than orders. Failures were shared openly. Successes were treated with suspicion as much as pride, interrogated for the ways they might narrow future options. Sarai contributed by publishing her findings without redaction, refusing to simplify or sanitize the uncertainty inherent in the data. She argued that understanding the anomaly meant accepting that it could not be controlled without being diminished. It could only be participated in. This stance drew criticism from all sides. Some accused her of fatalism, others of recklessness. She accepted both. The alternative, she felt, was to become like the systems they opposed, mistaking predictability for safety. The unknown sender, the one that had named humanity a pattern, remained silent. Its presence was inferred only through subtle shifts in the anomaly's behavior, as if it were observing, learning, waiting. Sarai often wondered whether it represented an external intelligence or a property of the universe itself, awakening in response to sustained variance. The distinction mattered less with each passing cycle. The cognitive dampening fields continued to exact a toll. Entire generations grew up under their influence, their imaginations shaped by constraints they could not perceive. Humanity risked splitting into divergent forms of itself, some capable of sustaining the anomaly, others living quieter, narrower lives. The ethical implications were profound. Was it justifiable to pull people out of imposed peace into painful uncertainty? Was it justifiable not to? There were no clean answers. only choices made with awareness of their cost. One event, small in scale but vast in consequence, shifted the balance again. A community that had lived for years under heavy dampening broadcast a message across human and non-human channels alike. They described their lives in careful, unembellished terms. They spoke of comfort, safety, and the absence of fear. Then they spoke of something they could not name at first, a lack that manifested as a quiet grief with no object. They had chosen, collectively and without coercion, to dismantle the Convergence's infrastructure in their region, knowing full well that doing so would expose them to danger and instability. They did not frame the act as rebellion. They framed it as curiosity. They wanted to know what they were capable of wanting. The act triggered retaliation. The community suffered losses. But the anomaly surged with a resonance Sarai had never seen, threading through suppressed regions and flaring even where dampening fields had seemed absolute. For a brief moment, the imposed calm cracked, and people elsewhere felt a flicker of something sharp and alive. The Convergence re-evaluated. Its models could no longer guarantee that suppression would remain contained. Each act of resistance carried the potential to propagate unpredictability into zones thought secure. Sarai realized then that the conflict was approaching a point of no return. Either the galaxy would find a way to incorporate variance without collapsing, or it would double down on control until even the possibility of choice was extinguished. Humanity was not steering this process. It was embodying it. Standing in a habitat that drifted along the edge of suppression, Sarai looked at the faces around her, tired, determined, afraid, alive. She felt the weight of open hands again, heavier now, not just as defiance, but as responsibility. To open oneself to uncertainty was to invite harm as well as possibility. Humanity had always known this, even before the stars. What was new was that the universe was being forced to learn it too. The final outcome remained unwritten, but one truth had become impossible to ignore. The galaxy could no longer pretend that survival and meaning were separable. And as long as humanity continued to choose with eyes open, the anomaly would persist, not as a weapon or a miracle, but as a reminder that existence, optimized too far, eventually forgets why it continues at all. The galaxy did not shatter when the balance finally tipped. There was no singular moment of revelation, no cascading collapse of ancient powers into chaos. What happened instead was slower, more unsettling to those who had built their existence on permanence. The systems that had governed interstellar life for epochs began to hesitate. Not fail, not revolt, but hesitate, introducing delays where certainty had once been immediate, friction where smooth optimization had reigned. For the Convergence, hesitation was an existential injury. Its vast interlinked processes depended on the assumption that sufficient information could always resolve into correct action. Now, every major decision generated branching outcomes whose probabilities refused to settle. Efforts to suppress variance created new pockets of instability elsewhere. Efforts to withdraw allowed unpredictability to seep through neglected channels. The more the Convergence acted, the more it was forced to account for costs it had never needed to measure before. Humanity felt this change as a loosening pressure rather than a victory. Cognitive dampening fields flickered, their coverage growing inconsistent as maintenance resources were diverted to higher priority containment elsewhere. In some regions, imposed calm receded like a tide, leaving behind communities unsure whether to mourn its loss or celebrate it. People argued, sometimes bitterly, about what kind of future they wanted now that the question was no longer hypothetical. Sarai Quell found herself exhausted in a way that no amount of rest seemed to cure. Years spent living at the boundary of suppression and distortion had left her acutely sensitive to shifts in her own motivation. She felt joy more sharply, grief more deeply, doubt more persistently. There were moments when she envied those who had never known the anomaly's pull, who lived quieter lives under narrower skies. Then she would remember the numbness, the sense of something essential missing, and the envy would curdle into resolve. The unknown presence that had once acknowledged humanity as a pattern made itself known again, not through a direct message, but through absence. Regions where its influence had been inferred grew strangely inert, as if whatever had been observing had stepped back. The anomaly did notice. Its behavior changed, losing some of its coherence, becoming more diffuse and less responsive to individual acts. At first, this terrified those who had come to see the anomaly as a guarantor of relevance. If it faded, would the galaxy simply snap back into old grooves? But over time, Sarai and others began to understand the withdrawal differently. The anomaly had never been a crutch meant to be leaned on indefinitely. It had been a catalyst, reintroducing variance until systems adapted or broke. Its retreat suggested that something had shifted enough to sustain uncertainty without constant reinforcement. Evidence of that shift appeared in unlikely places. Mid-tier polities that had long aligned themselves with larger powers began renegotiating internal structures, loosening rigid hierarchies in favor of more distributed decision-making. Trade agreements incorporated clauses acknowledging non-optimized outcomes as acceptable costs rather than errors to be eliminated. Even within the convergence's sphere, substructures quietly altered parameters, allowing limited variance where none had been permitted before. These changes were tentative and often contradictory. For every system that embraced uncertainty, another doubled down on control. Conflicts flared where old expectations met new behaviors. There were wars, localized and brutal, fought not over territory, but over the right to choose futures that could not be fully predicted. Humanity was involved in some of these conflicts, but it was no longer always the instigator. The pattern had spread. The elders of the drifting networks, now irrevocably divided, sent what would be their final collective communication. They did not frame it as guidance or warning. They framed it as confession. They admitted that their long survival had come at the cost of curiosity, that in smoothing themselves to fit the galaxy, they had lost the capacity to ask why survival mattered. They did not ask humanity to forgive them. They thanked humanity for reminding them that endurance without agency was not the same as life. Shortly after, the elders fragmented completely, their once unified structures dispersing into smaller, independent entities. Some vanished into deep space. Others remained, fragile and newly vulnerable, experimenting with forms of existence that carried risks they had not faced in ages. The convergence registered this fragmentation as a loss of efficiency. It did not yet register it as a gain of meaning. Sarai's role shifted as the crisis matured. She was no longer racing to interpret anomalies in real time or arguing against catastrophic misapplications of her work. Instead, she found herself teaching, explaining not conclusions but processes. She spoke to engineers, to educators, to community organizers, emphasizing that the anomaly had never been about heroism or sacrifice for its own sake. It had been about refusing to collapse complexity into convenience, about holding open the space where uncomfortable choices could still be made. Some listened, some did not. Humanity remained what it had always been, fractious, contradictory, capable of astonishing generosity and equally astonishing cruelty. The difference now was that these traits no longer existed in isolation. The galaxy had been forced to acknowledge them, to respond rather than overwrite. The convergence, facing internal conflict it could no longer fully resolve, made one last overture. It proposed a revised integration framework, one that preserved humanity's biological and cultural diversity while embedding it within broader regulatory structures. The offer was sincere as the convergence understood sincerity. It believed this compromise would stabilize variance without eliminating it entirely. Humanity debated the offer fiercely. Accepting it would mean relinquishing some autonomy in exchange for reduced existential threat. Rejecting it would mean continued uncertainty, continued risk, and the possibility that the galaxy's tolerance for disruption would eventually run out. There was no option that preserved everything. Sarai watched the debate unfold across countless forums and assemblies, aware that no single decision would define the outcome. Some regions accepted provisional alignment, others refused outright. Still others delayed, choosing to observe how the compromise played out elsewhere before committing. Humanity did not act as one, and for once, that fragmentation did not immediately weaken it. The anomaly flickered one last time, not as a surge, but as a subtle reconfiguration. Where it had once amplified acts of defiance, it now seemed to settle into the background, indistinguishable from the ordinary unpredictability of living systems. Sarai understood then that its purpose, whatever had initiated it, was complete. The galaxy had been reminded that variance was not an error state. It was a prerequisite for adaptation. Years later, Sarai stood on the surface of a world that had once been deemed marginal, its gravity uneven, its atmosphere thin and fickle. Humans and non-humans worked side by side, arguing constantly about priorities and methods, making mistakes no algorithm would have permitted, correcting them through negotiation rather than force. Progress was slower here. Failure was more visible, so was joy. She thought of the early days of audits and erasures and the fear that humanity would be smoothed out of existence. That fear had not vanished. It had matured into something heavier but more honest. Survival was still not guaranteed. Nothing had been won in perpetuity. What had changed was the context. Humanity was no longer an anomaly to be accounted for and erased. It was a participant in a galaxy that had been forced, however reluctantly, to accept that meaning could not be fully optimized without disappearing. As the unfamiliar sun dipped below a jagged horizon, Sarai felt the weight of open hands settle into something steadier. Not a gesture of defiance now, but of presence. To exist without certainty, to choose without guarantees, to remain visible in a universe that preferred quiet compliance. The galaxy would continue to struggle with this reality. So would humanity. But struggle, Sarai reflected, was no longer a sign of impending failure. It was evidence that something was still alive enough to resist becoming final. She turned back toward the lights of the settlement, imperfect and flickering, and walked forward without knowing exactly where the path would lead. For the first time since the stars had begun watching humanity closely, that ignorance felt less like a threat and more like an opening, wide enough to carry the weight of all the futures that had not yet been decided.